Good afternoon and welcome to the Real Living Wage workshop session today. My name is Debbie Shaw and I'm the responsible training and procurement manager from NEUPC, and alongside my colleague Helen Dodd-Williams, who's the head of strategic procurement at NWUPC, who will be here throughout the session, although you may not be able to see them. Just before we hand over to our speakers, who are Mark Walton from the University of Liverpool and Dan Howard from the Living Wage Foundation, I'd just like to go over some session etiquette. We do welcome comments and questions, however, we request that these are asked at the end of the session, and they can be posted during the session using the question and answer function at the bottom of the screen. You can also click chat if you want to make any comments as well. This session will be recorded and made available after the event via our Wover platform and our own YouTube channels. For those that are watching, please be assured that we cannot see or hear you. The use of your camera is optional. However, it'd be lovely to see your faces. We ask that microphones are muted during the session itself. I will now hand you over to Mark Walton from the University of Liverpool and to Dan Howard from the Living Wage Foundation, who will be talking today about the living wage and their experience of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie, for the introduction. And yeah, just to introduce myself, I'm Dan Howard from the Living Wage Foundation. I lead our accreditation work in the Northwest region. Mark, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself quickly first before we get into the presentation.
Yeah, I'm Mark Walton, Head of Procurement at the University of Liverpool. We went through accreditation a couple of years ago. I'm just going to give you a little bit of information as to how that's impacted and what we needed to do in procurement to achieve the accreditation and what we need to do in a continuing basis to maintain that accreditation.
Thanks, Mark. So yeah, before we get into that, I'll provide a bit of a background to the living wage, where it came from, a bit of an overview of what we do as the Living Wage Foundation, and then finally start talking about the accreditation process that employers can go through if they do want to become an accredited living wage employer. First of all, on the Living Wage campaign, so the Living Wage campaign has been fighting for wages that meet the real cost of living since 2001. The campaign is based on the belief that no one should be working full-time and still be earning less than they need to live. It began when a group of people from churches, mosques, schools and synagogues in East London met in a community hall to talk about the issues affecting their lives. The hall that they met in is a short ride away from Canary Wharf, an area that has obviously seen huge change over the past few decades. When the docks closed in the 1980s, many skilled jobs were lost, and whilst regeneration brought significant new investment from the financial and property sectors, many of the people in that hall felt that their communities had not benefited from that regeneration. House prices had soared and jobs available to them in the new buildings were often minimum wage positions as cleaners or security guards. Back then in 2001, the minimum wage was just £3.70 an hour. And many of these people were working full-time, sometimes in 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs, but still not earning enough to live. So the campaign for employers to pay a real living wage came out of that room, based on the idea that a hard day's work deserves a fair day's pay. The Living Wage Foundation was founded in 2011, and our organisation has 3 main functions in growing the number of workers who are paid the real living wage. So first of all, we oversee the calculation of the real living wage, which is the only hourly rate that is calculated based on what a full-time worker needs to meet the basic cost of living in the UK. And it's important here to differentiate between the real living wage, the accredited living wage employers pay, and the national living wage, which was introduced by the government in 2016, which is based on an ambition to meet a certain level of median income by 2024, and is not based on the cost of living, despite what the name says. And the second part of what we do is accreditation. So we work with employers to pay the real living wage, so directly employed and third-party contracted staff, and go through the process of making sure that all relevant staff are receiving the real living wage, and hold organisations to that accreditation. And finally, we influence as well. So we promote responsible employers who choose to pay the real living wage and encourage others to do so. And one of the main ways that we do this is through Living Wage Week that we have each year in November. There are now over 8,000 accredited living wage employers in the UK, and these range from household names like IKEA, Nationwide, Barratt Homes, to thousands of SMEs across the country. And collectively, these employers have put over £1.2 billion back into the pockets of over 300,000 low-paid workers since the campaign began 20 years ago. And among those numbers, there are over 75 universities who are accredited living wage employers. These include, obviously, University of Liverpool. We've got Mark joining us from there today, but also in the Northwest, we've got University of Manchester, Manchester Metropolitan University, University of Salford, University of Walton, and we have seen quite considerable growth of the numbers of universities who are accredited living wage employers over the past few years. In terms of the accreditation process and what employers need to do to be accredited, I know Mark's going to touch on the requirements in procurement, but I'll just give an overview of what the overall requirements are for accreditation. So the first requirement is that employers pay the real living wage to all of their directly employed staff. So the real living wage is currently £9.50 in the UK and £10.85 in London. So there's a slightly higher rate in London to reflect the higher cost of living in the capital. So all directly employed members of staff must be paid that rate per hour as a minimum. And then the second part of it is that all regular third-party contracted staff who provide labour to an organisation must be paid the real living wage for the time they work on your contract. So this is obviously a slightly more complex part of the accreditation, but it is also a really important part of the work we do. Lots of the people who get a pay rise from living wage accreditations often sit within that third party bracket. So for example, when we first worked initially with some of the big banks to accredit, you might think, well, banks already obviously pay one above the real living wage, but actually they had huge numbers of third-party contracted staff who received pay rises through the accreditation. So it's a really important part of the work that we do. So they're the kind of, they're the sort of two sides to the accreditation, and that's a very kind of quick sort of brief overview of the process and what organisations need to do. I'll hand over to Mark now to speak about the procurement side, but yeah, please do ask any questions and look forward to hearing from you after Mark's spoken about the procurement side. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Dan. First of all, I suppose we need to talk about the scope of which employees from third parties are covered by the accreditation. It's defined as anybody who does 2 hours or more per week in 8 consecutive weeks. So it gives you a bit of a target audience for the contracts that you currently have in place when you're looking for the accreditation. What we started to do then was look at our contracts and look down the services, and the main areas where we felt there was risk were in the traditionally low paid sectors like catering staff, cleaning staff, security staff, but also we get a lot of agency staff on temporary basis that may be there for quite a number of weeks. So we need to make sure that any agency that supplied us with staff that work for us directly then were signed up to agreeing that anybody they provided to us was going to earn the real living wage. We wrote out to those contractors that we felt were going to be affected, and we got back from them, all bar one, that they were already paying the real minimum wage. The big area for us was on our security side, where they had a number of operators that we had within our contract on our campus that were below that. So we had to be cognizant of what the impact was going to be on contract costs for us, because clearly they're providing a service and providing people to us, the cost is in the people. So we had to make sure the budget holder was aware of that before we requested that they began paying the real living wage ahead of us going for the accreditation. obviously mopping up everything that we already had. We also need to think about going forward when we retender some of these or any new tenders that we do for new contracts. If we decided we were going to outsource more of our services, obviously it would be more impactful. So we need to include that in all of our tenders when we go out and stress that we are a real living wage accredited employer, and we expect that any staff that they use for providing services either on our behalf or to us on our campus are all paid the real living wage. So that is factored into the tender bids when we get them into us. The impact that we found within the was not that significant. They had a few operatives that were paid at just slightly below the real living wage, and we brought them up, so they've had a little bit of a pay rise. And again, obviously, you need to monitor this because the real living wage is reassessed every year. So I think there's a grace period of something like 6 months, I think, where we between them announcing the new real living wage for the following 12 months, you're expected to adopt that new figure within that 6 months. But we've not found it, in terms of procurement, we've not found it overly onerous, and the suppliers have been very receptive to it as well, because it's a good thing for them and for their staff, and it provides better motivation for their staff, etc. So it can reduce turnover in your suppliers. So overall, for procurement, for what I would say was relatively little effort, we've seen some benefits that we might not have gained without it. I don't think there's a lot more to say on it really, because we found it quite a smooth process for us. There's little more to add than what I've already said, I think.
Thanks, Mark. And yeah, I should have said that. Yeah, the rates are announced each November, so they're obviously recalculated each year to basically take account of what the cost of living is in the UK. So they're announced in November each year during Living Wage Week. And then organisations have 6 months to implement the new rates. So that usually works out at sort of early May time. We obviously don't expect organisations to have to implement it straight away, because yeah, that would be a bit of a nightmare. And we only find out what the rates are going to be about a week before they are publicly announced. So yeah, we need to give organisations a bit of time on that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if we have any questions. Debbie, I don't know if you're there. If we have any, want to bring anyone in?
Hi Dan, hi Mark. A couple of questions, particularly for Mark really. Did you find that the prices that you pay were significantly increased when you started building this into your tenders?
No, the short answer is no, we didn't find them significantly increased. I have to say, as a University of Liverpool, we don't have a lot of outsourced for services like catering and like cleaning. A lot of it is in-house. So there was a lot of work for our HR people to make sure they were being paid the appropriate rates. For us, a lot of our cleaning and catering staff that we have to take on to supplement our in-house, they are through agencies, and it's that element of going to those agencies up front to say that we are a real living wage employer. We expect you to be paid to pay your people the real living wage, and then we notify them when it changes in case they're not on board with it. The comments we got back from them were all that yes, we pay above the real living wage anyway. Now, whether we just happened to have good agencies that did that anyway, I'm not sure, but we didn't notice any significant increase in our contract costs. But as I say, the contract cleaners, it might have been a different issue. We had a bit of a debate over, we have a deep clean over the summer within our halls of residence, and I suspect that they're close to the real living wage, or but maybe slightly below it, but they're only on site for 4 weeks. So we had a bit of a debate, do we really want to enforce it there or not? It's the right thing to do, but did they have the budget at the time? And we're revisiting that actually this summer to see what we can do about trying to enforce the real living wage, even with those contractors that come in on a short-term basis. But overall, I would say, no, we've not seen a significant rise in costs for us.
And another one for Mark, how do you ensure that the employees are genuinely receiving the rate that they should?
Short answer is we can't unless we just ask them. And that's the only way we can do it, to make sure they are being paid the real living wage. It's not something within my realm, within procurement, but we try to advise people within, make sure people are aware across the various sectors of the university. So in our cleaning departments, in our catering departments, they are aware that we are a real living wage, and anybody they employ on an agency basis or a temporary basis should be being paid the real living wage. But there's no way of checking that without asking the individuals themselves. It is a little bit like modern slavery, I suppose, where the best source is the person themselves, if they're willing to speak to you. But we don't have a program of going out and checking whether these people are being paid the real living wage or not. I should say as well, people like apprentices are exempt from that, because they tend to be on some kind of scheme, and the rates are often dictated by that scheme. But it is basically just asking the people and making sure. Our main thing is making sure people within the university understand that we are a real living wage employer, and it is their responsibility to make sure that any people they take on, because we don't necessarily in procurement centrally see everything obviously that happens across the university. So we try to empower everybody and give everybody the knowledge they need to manage it locally.
Thank you for that. Another question's come through. In practical terms, post-accreditation, how are suppliers monitored on a yearly basis in regards to the real living wage? And how is the accredited organisation monitored by the foundation?
In terms of the first part about us monitoring, it's part of the contract management. So we do manage the security contract that we have at Liverpool. I've referred to that a few times because that is the one area that we did see that was impacted. So we will raise that at our quarterly reviews with them to make sure they are paying it. And when the new rate was announced back in November, we made sure our contract runs, I think, from January. So we said we should implement this from January, and they're people who were on the real living wage previously got a slight pay rise with effect from the 1st of January, but it's picked up in the contract management of those contracts.
And I can come in on the kind of like foundation side on that. I think something that Mark alluded to there is it is often about communication on this, on the monitoring side. So making sure that the living wage requirements are being communicated internally to everyone that might be procuring services, but also for directly employed staff as well. And also communicate to individual staff members so that they're aware of what they should be being paid. And there's a clear line for where they can raise an issue if they feel they're not being paid the rate that they should be. In terms of how we monitor accreditation at the foundation, the way that we operate is through a employee whistleblowing service. So if an employee at an organisation thinks they should be being paid the real living wage, but they're not, well, then they can get in contact with us directly, anonymously, to the foundation, and then what we can do is we'll then work with that employer to find out what's going on with that one person, basically. And on the whole, when those instances do happen, it's not that they've been deliberately paid less, it's more they might have just been missed off or something's been miscommunicated, and that's usually kind of the best way to rectify it, if we can keep it direct between ourselves and the organisation.
Thanks, Dan.
I suppose
Sorry, Mark, carry on.
Sorry, Helen. The only other thing I've not touched on there are construction contracts. Most of the people within the construction contracts are professionals and they're quite well paid, but there are levels within contracts where they may be close to the real living wage. And now we do expect our, I don't know what we call them now, CDMs, is it? What used to be project managers and clerk of works, we expect them to be checking that and liaising with the main contractor to make sure this is filtering as far as possible through our through the supply chain on a main contractor contract. It's a little bit more difficult, of course, because you're going down your tiers of supply chain, but we're trying to encourage them as much as possible that they should also be paying their people the real living wage as a minimum.
Thanks, Mark. And for anybody that wants to start on the journey that Mark's obviously taken, what would be the first steps, would you advise, Dan?
So the first step would be to get in touch with the Living Wage Foundation. So you can either do that through our website, or obviously I'm sure my details will be shared either after this event or through the event. So please do get in touch with myself. And then once you get in touch with us, we will then, you'll be sent all of the information about the accreditation, the requirements, and then we can talk to you and guide you through the process, basically. So that is the best place to start. And obviously, as we've said, there's two main parts of accreditation. The first part is the directly employed staff, and the other side is the third-party contracted staff. So we will work with you on any barriers or challenges you might have in implementing the real living wage. We can share learning from organisations who've gone through the process, like Mark has spoken about today, and yeah, to share that kind of information and learning. And like I said, we've got 8,000 accredited employers now across a very sort of strong range of industries and sectors. So we've got quite a lot of kind of intelligence about how organisations can do it. So yeah, I would encourage anyone to either go on our website and submit an inquiry or get in touch with myself.
Thanks, Dan. I think Debbie's got a question for you.
I have, yes. You mentioned before about apprentices, Mark, and for both you and Dan, I'm just interested to know what your sort of view is on these sort of age-related payment, because obviously the government living wage only applies after the age of 25. And I know many in the university sector have taken the approach, well, if somebody is employed on a grade, they get paid the grade for the job regardless of age, but many of our contractors don't. So that was part one of my question. And then part two of my question, which maybe Dan might be more aware of, is, do you think there is going to be a time in the near future when we might just have one living wage? So there isn't a real living wage as such anymore, and the government adopts that.
Yeah, one thing I think on the apprentices issue, Debbie, part of what we're looking at, and it's a growing thing, and there's a session later on social value, and new apprentices in some of our contracts is something that we might measure. Are they taking on a new apprentice that is a resident of Liverpool, for instance, might be. So we don't want to dissuade them from taking on new apprentices by saying that, and above that you're going to pay them more. So it's a little bit of a difficult one, I think. I take your point that if you're going up to these days, apprentices could be any age, couldn't they?
They could.
So it is a difficult one, but they're getting a helping hand, and at least they've got an apprenticeship kind of thing. And you wouldn't want to dissuade suppliers from doing that. So we've not really addressed that as an issue here at Liverpool, but I can see there's a bit of a conflict there.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, Mark, that's exactly the reason why apprentices aren't included as a requirement within the living wage accreditation, because we don't want to discourage organisations from providing those opportunities. And obviously, if a person is on an apprenticeship, then that's a structured training programme that they're receiving skills that are going to help them in the future. So whilst we would encourage organisations to pay apprentices as much as possible, obviously, and we know many organisations do pay apprentices the real living wage, we understand that that's just not feasible for all organisations to implement across the board. But the point of people later on in their careers, going back and retraining and becoming an apprentice, I think we've seen from some of the employers that we work with that where they do pay apprentices a real living wage, that enables people who might want to change career to do an apprenticeship because they are still earning a decent wage whilst they are training as well. So obviously we'd encourage organisations to pay people as much as they can on apprenticeships, but understand that can't be implemented across the board, basically. And then I can come to your question, Debbie, as well on the kind of, the national living wage and the real living wage and where those two sit together. I think obviously since the national living wage was implemented in 2016, there's been year-on-year increases to the pay at the bottom end for those workers, which is obviously fantastic. And I think it's obviously, I don't think the living wage campaign that we run can take full credit for that, but I think there's partial credit that we can take for pressuring the government to do that. And I think, you know, there's recognition that people should be paid at least a wage that meets the cost of living. Obviously, for us as the foundation, the ultimate aim for us is that everyone gets paid as much as they need to live. And if the government do increase the national living wage to meet that rate, then that's fantastic. And that's what we want. That's what we're here for. So we are going to carry on doing the work that we're doing until that happens, basically. And you know, the way that we work is directly with employers. We're not a lobbying organisation. We don't lobby government. We work with employers to act now. So that's what we'll carry on doing until we get to the point where, where the national living wage does actually meet the cost of living, and then we'll achieve what we set out to achieve when it started 20 years ago.
There are all the questions that have come through, Debbie.
Right, okay. Well, thank you very much. That was really very interesting. So that concludes the end of our real living wage session. Thank you both, Dan and Mark, for your insights into the real living wage and your experience, Mark, in implementing it. Thank you for your time. We hope everybody that was watching found this session useful and informative.